Hey Wargamers, welcome back to the channel, Death from Above Wargaming. I'm Aaron, and I'm back tonight with another mech review. So, when we first released the Zeus ZEU-6T, it was initial sort of test, it was a pilot if you will, of our initial Battlytics engine. We got a lot of feedback from you guys in the community at large. We revised the engine, we tweaked some of the numbers, we added some additional simulations, and so we have Battlytics 2.0 now. Subsequently released the Whitworth review, which, guys seem to like that. So we're going to go back and do a take two on the Zeus in the new model and see how it stacks up. Now, I'm not going to cheat you. I am also going to release at the same time a mech review on the Wolverine as well. So keep an eye out for that. That way, I know this one is kind of a redo, so I wanted to give you something fresh as well. So keep an eye out, like I said, for that Wolverine review as well. But stay tuned for the Zeus ZEU-6T. Mech review's coming right up. All right, guys, so here we are, take two on the Zeus ZEU-6T. So this is, again, my favorite mech, one of my favorites at least, probably tied with the Marauder. It's an 80-ton assault mech. It has a battle value of 1,436. It's an Intersphere mech, obviously, and the production year here on this guy is about 3026. That's on this particular variant. The Zeus was around a lot longer. There's the 6S with the autocannon 5. This variant has the PPC on it, which for a while they could not fit in the lore on the mech, due to some technological constraints. So that becomes available in the late Succession Wars area and is available all the way through the Renaissance until that Lost Tech gets refitted on this chassis. So a movement profile on this mech is a 4.6. It has 19 heat sinks and 11.5 tons of armor, which is admittedly a little bit on the light side for an 80-ton assault mech, but still provides a fairly decent 74.5% of total armor coverage. Now this mech does not have any hand actuators. Instead, it mounts an LRM-15 on the right arm and that devastating PPC in the left arm. It also has a large laser backing up that PPC in the left torso and a pair of medium lasers, one in the CT that's facing forward and then a rear-mounted medium laser in the left torso. The ammo for the LRM is packed into that right torso, and if you look at the overall armor diagram there in the center, you'll notice that those side torsos are a little bit under-armored, and that is actually going to be a little bit of an issue. Even the CT is a little bit under-armored as well, so we'll look a little closer at that when we dive into the defensive analysis. But before that, why don't we jump into the offensive benchmarks? Okay, so on the offensive benchmark side, we have two primary benchmarks that we run. The first one in the top left-hand part of your screen is the heat benchmark. So what we're doing here, just to explain how this simulation works, on the x-axis you'll notice there's a series of turns, turn 1 all the way through turn 12, and they're at different prescribed ranges. So it starts at 21, 18, 15, 14, 12. Now these are listed in inches, could be hexes, same difference. As you know, at DFA we play on on an open world 3D map type thing, so we don't really use the hex nomenclature, but either way, the mechanics in terms of the gameplay are the same. So this first top graph, there's two areas, right? There's the white area, which represents our baseline damage, and then the red area, which is our red line damage. So how do we get these? Well, essentially for the baseline damage, what we're doing is we're running a simulation. Basically, it's a solver algorithm that looks at the mech's weapons, and it tries to find the most optimal damage output at that range. And one of the constraints being, what's the heat threshold? So on the baseline, we always set the heat threshold to 4. That means we'll never exceed 4 points of heat, so no penalties whatsoever. And what kind of damage can we put out? So you'll see here in the white, basically as the mech gets closer to that 6-7 inch mark, around turns 8 and 9, that's where the damage peaks. And then once you start to crest in to minimum range and the LRM-15 ammo runs out, the damage starts to decrease a little bit. So that baseline output numerically is represented in that bar chart in the middle of the screen there. And so you can see the white bar hitting 130.4 points of damage over that 12-turn period. Now that is your average calculated damage, or ACD. You'll see that acronym used throughout these mech reviews here. And basically what that is the algorithm is going to calculate the probability to hit at a given range, right? So it calculates a gator, and there's never any cover penalties or anything like that. So it calculates a gator. And so, for example, let's say, you have a 7+ target number. So I believe that is like a 58% chance to hit, maybe, or something along those lines. So if you're firing a PPC, it takes 10 damage from your PPC, multiplies it by that 58% chance to hit, and you get 5.8 damage. So your average calculated damage for the PPC for that specific target number is 5.8, right? So when it finds the optimum grouping at that range, given the heat constraint, it just basically does an addition there and adds up all the weapons ACDs at the particular target number at that range for the weapon, and voila. And then we add it up over the 12 turns, and you get the 130.4. So on the red line and the heat output, what we're doing here is we're setting that heat threshold to 29. We want to see how fast this mech can heat up. And what you see with the Zeus is it can heat up fairly quickly. As soon as that large laser comes into play at 15 inches, that heat ramp is pretty steep. And just within a few turns, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, boom, you're running it at 29 points of heat. So it has a very aggressive heat ramp. That tells us two things. One, you got to be careful when you're playing this mech. And two, that there is a lot of opportunity to improve the damage over baseline, because basically the currency for damage is heat. Said it before, basically that is how you generate more damage, is by you trade off for heat. So the next benchmark here on your screen, that's the one that's right below the heat benchmark. So this is the one with the white and the blue. Same white damage benchmark, baseline damage benchmark. But the blue area in the back there behind that represents our optimized benchmark. So in this benchmark, what we do is we play with the heat numbers at each range increment, right? So maybe we dial it up a little bit once we're within large laser range. We pull that large laser trigger a couple more times, generate a little bit of heat, and you can see that heat line sort of spike up right around turn 4 and turn 6, and you can see the damage correspondingly spike up as well. And then when you get in closer range, you're alpha striking a couple times, or at least firing as much as you can. Now, the other thing these benchmarks take into account is ammunition. So you'll notice that the Zeus runs out of LRM-15 ammo right at turn 8, because it only has 8 rounds. So if you look at the weapons groupings below these offensive benchmarks, you'll see that LRM-15 is a staple from basically turn 1 all the way through to turn 8. And then obviously the mech is unable to fire that weapon anymore. But you can kind of see there how it's mixing and matching the weapons to create these area graphs and these plots. So when we optimize the damage, we go from 130 to 142.9. That's not bad. Remember, this is average damage. So this is basically like if you played this game 10,000 times and the mech hit these ranges every time, this is what you would get, right? So getting an guarantee of 12 damage, right, 13 almost, every single time you play the game over 12 turns, it's not bad. It's extra point of damage, every turn basically is how that kind of averages out. And then also you notice there, the other point of note in that bar chart is the 208 on the line chart. That's how much heat cumulatively it was able to build up over the course of those 12 turns. So again, if we held the trigger down, we're still trying to maximize our damage output, but irrespective of heat, what do you get? And you get 208. And the reason the damage plummets, by the way, on the red line is because you're starting to stack gunnery penalties, right? And the simulation isn't thinking about that. What it's thinking about is, given the heat constraint, what's my best option? So in this scenario, again, it's just trying to look at how fast it can ramp the heat up. So just hopefully that clarifies that. And the optimized one, that's really where we're tweaking it for what would we probably actually do as players when we're using this mech. So that's the left side of your screen. The right side of your screen is called a lethality index. Now I'm going to dive into this and explain it in detail. We talked a little bit about it in the Whitworth review. This is new to Battlytics 2.0. And what we were looking at here is we were trying to differentiate between, for example, a mech like a Grasshopper, which has a lot of firepower, 4 mediums, a large, an LRM-5, versus an Awesome or something that has, a Victor where it's got an AC-20. Maybe the total damage output is roughly the same, but 4 medium lasers is not as lethal as an AC-20. Do the same total damage. So how do we factor that in? Well, it's not really reflected in the average calculated damage. It will be reflected in this lethality index. So here's what happens. We run a simulation 10,000 times. We basically run a trimmed down game of BattleTech where your mech, so in this case the Zeus, is going up against a Javelin. And this is the Fire Javelin. I believe it's the 10F, or you correct me if I'm wrong. It's the one with the 4 medium lasers. I don't remember the variant off the top of my head. But basically, this Javelin does not have any chance for an ammo kill. It's got 6 tons of armor. It's got a 696 movement profile, so it's going to be a little difficult to hit because it's claiming that +3 for quite a bit of time, even after a couple of motive hits. And essentially what we're doing is we're pitting the Zeus against this Javelin over a series of prescribed turns at the exact same ranges, from 21 inches all the way down to 1 inch, point blank range. The Javelin's not shooting back, it's just getting shot. And what we're looking at is how many times does the Zeus kill this mech? How often are we looking at head kills versus just coring this mech out or ripping it to shreds? How much average damage per hit are we doing? How many critical hits did we generate on average in 12 turns? And what's our time to kill? So let's talk about the donut chart here. So this shows you how many times the Zeus was able to kill the Javelin. 80.5% of the time, it was able to bring down that Javelin in 12 turns. That's not bad. 68% of the time, it was a CT kill, which means, you're either blasting through the side torsos into the CT, right? Damage transfers, you're dealing motive damage and slowing this thing down and then creaming it. So 68% of the time, it's your typical just cored out Javelin. 12.1% of the time, you're looking at head kills. Now, 12.1 is about 3 times higher than the average, and that's because this mech has 2 big hitters, right? The large laser and the PPC. And those weapons on a mech like this, where you can hit at range, if you land 2 headshots in a turn, or, successive turns, one on turn, turn 2, another one on turn 5, Javelin's toast, right? Okay, so speaking of firing weapons, an important point of note in the lethality index, the lethality index knows what weapons to fire based on our optimized damage grouping. So if you want to know what weapons this Zeus is firing at what range, you can look at those groupings there on the bottom of the screen and you'll see exactly what weapons are being fired at which turn. So it uses what we optimize in the lethality index. So as we're optimizing, we're kind of looking at all of these things. It's pretty neat to see it sort of come to life, right? So some of the metrics we draw out of this simulation. And just a reminder, the simulation is run 10,000 times, right? It takes about 10-15 seconds for this one to run. It's pretty quick. And then it spits out all these numbers. So on the right there, you'll see the yellow bar. That's damage per hit, and that's at 6.9. Why? Well, it's got a medium laser. It's got an LRM-15, right? So with the LRM damage, right, that's variable, and it's looking at damage per cluster, right? So we group it into clusters of 5 points of damage. But it does have those big hitters like the PPC and the large laser. So at the end of the day, when we average it all out, you end up with 6.9 points of damage. So it's a little bit above average. Critical hits, we're looking at 4.29. So it's not like a crit generating machine, but it's not terrible. You're getting a 1 crit every 3 turns or so. And again, this is not a statistic that you should, put your Zeus on the table and be like, all right, every 3 turns I'm getting a crit. Again, this is a benchmark, right, to give you an idea of how it competes against some other mechs, So if you want to put it against a Victor, you would look at the 2 mech reviews for those mechs, when we do the Victor, and you say, this might be better for this role or this particular task or mission or whatever. All right, so time to kill is a bit of an extrapolation. So what we do here is we plot the mech's kill curve over the 10,000 simulations, right? And so this mech got, again, 80.5% of the time. That basically means it killed it 8,050 times out of the 10,000, right? So we get to that point and we have sort of could be exponential, could be a power function, could be something else. But basically we fit a trend line to that and we trend it out to, maximum kills and what turn would we be at. And the Zeus ends up at 12.7 for that. So not terrible. Again, it's not like a stone cold killer. I think I used the same phrase in the Wolverine review. These mechs are definitely not like assassin mechs, but 12.7 is pretty good. It's not too bad. And then on the very bottom, you can kind of see just the cumulative kill curve, right? Where it's getting the motive hits, that's the yellow-orange line. How many head kills it's getting, CT kills. What's interesting is if you look at the head kill, it does not like spike up. It's pretty, even right around turn 9. You can start seeing them come into play. And then it's, the thickness of that area, doesn't really increase too much. So you are sort of seeing those long-range head kills from those big guns like we talked about earlier. But this just gives you a little bit of information. So I know that was long-winded. Again, this review is meant to be a little more informative about some of the assumptions that go into the model. So why don't we dive into the defensive stuff and take a look at some of those benchmarks. So in this screen, as these things are populating, what you're looking at, big armor diagram in the center, some statistics and metrics that came out of our defensive simulation, and then across the top, basically a dive into the mobility of the mech. So let's start with the mobility. Pretty straightforward. This is a 4.6 mech, and this bar chart at the top here shows you what's the modifier at a given MP penalty. So from full MP all the way to MP -6. And remember, this MP penalty, think about it like it could be from turning, going uphill, going in a river, taking a heat penalty, losing a foot actuator, right? Any of these things could have an impact, all of these things cumulatively. And when does this mech's movement start to degrade, right? And so on a 4.6 mech, what you see is you can claim that full +2 target mod with an MP -1. So, you can run that Zeus forward 5 hexes, 5 inches, change facing somewhere in between, still claim that full +2, go uphill, suffer a little bit of heat, which is important because this mech does get hot. So you can take on that first tier heat penalty and still be claiming a +2 as long as you're, just moving in a straight line. So, not too bad. It's got decent mobility. Nothing great. Probably 4.6s dominate the game in this era. I think that's probably the most common movement profile. But not great, not bad. So let's look at the armor diagram in the middle before we jump into the defensive sim. So this thing is a visualization to show us the actual armor, right? So that's the green bar. The black bar, behind it is basically what's the total armor for that location by percentage, right? So the green bar is a percent of the black bar. And then the yellow bar represents, the horizontal bar represents the expected value at that location. So how do we get the expected value? Well, if you remember on the first screen when we were doing sort of the technical overview, we said that this mech has 74.5% armor coverage. So we take that 74%, we multiply it by the maximum armor in each of those locations, well, you get that yellow bar. And you can see the distribution is off a little bit in this mech. It's over-armored on the arms, and it's under-armored in those side torsos. And in general, of course, we talked about 74.5% being a little bit low in general for this mech, a mech of this size at least. I mean, if you look at like the Awesome, just way more armor than this mech. But, the Zeus has got a lot of firepower. Not that the Awesome doesn't, but, the Zeus is also a lot faster, right? So all of these things kind of come into play. But anyway, back to this. I digress. The arms here, you can clearly see over-armored, side torsos under-armored. Now that's a problem because, again, that LRM-15 ammo is in that right torso. So if I'm designing this mech, that's the place I really want to protect the most. And I would assume that they put the armor on the arms because that's where their primary weapons are. But I would probably, if I was going to mod this mech, peel armor off of those arms, put it into those side torsos. All right, so let's talk about the defensive simulation. So the way this works, it's similar to the lethality simulation, except that your mech, right, the Zeus in this case, is approaching or closing with an Awesome, speaking of Awesomes. The Awesomes basically are test mech, and it is firing as many PPCs as it can without building up a penalty for gunnery, right? So it is going to I believe, fire 3 and then 3 and then 2, 3 and 3 and 2, whatever the pattern is. It is basically firing as many PPCs as it can as the Zeus closes, and basically get down to 1 inch. Now, what we measure is how long does the Zeus survive, right? How many turns does it survive? How many games does it survive? When is it taking motive hits? When is it taking ammo hits? These are all the things that we're really interested in learning about. So the Zeus actually had a very good run here. And again, this simulation, just like the lethality one, is run 10,000 times. Takes like 10 seconds or less to run, and you get these numbers. So on the motive hit side, it took 12.7% of the time basically it took motive hits 12.7% of the time. In the bottom right, you can kind of see the cumulative survivability. So you can see that orange-yellow line, right, and where it starts to trend up. Once you get within 7 inches, you can see those motive hits start to climb pretty rapidly, along with everything else, really. When we look at the next donut chart, it's broken down into 3 areas, the white being your survivability, which was 77.4%, total kills being 22.6%, broken out into ammo kills, which was 14.6%, and then just general CT kills, which was 8.1%. So overall, this mech survived, basically 3/4 of the time. So out of the 10,000 simulations, it's looking at, over 7,700 games. It actually made it all the way through 12 turns. Now, doesn't mean it made it through in great shape. It just meant that it was alive. Clearly, the closer you get, to that, to that awesome, it's dealing more damage. So once you get within 6 inches, you can kind of see there's a spike. The slope of that death curve increases. But what's interesting here is that this mech suffered almost twice as many deaths from ammunition hits than from CT kills. So that sort of reinforces, my assertion earlier that these side torsos really need to be beefed up. So again, we kind of take all this data, we look at the simulation results, and you can start to draw some conclusions, specifically around how you might play this mech, and again, what you might do if you were going to mod it. And again, peel that armor off the arms, maybe even a little bit off the back, stuff it on those torsos. So let's move into efficiency. Okay, so the efficiency analysis is probably one of the most complex ones, but I also think it's one of the most telling analyses in the Battlytics engine. It's pretty interesting. So what we do here first is we look at the effectiveness of a mech. So when we talk about effectiveness versus efficiency, effectiveness is like how well you do something. Efficiency is like how much waste do you generate when you do something. So the more efficient it is, the less waste you've got. So we want to first know, how well this mech does its job. And in order to do that, we take our offensive benchmark and we want to combine it with our defensive benchmark. And the way we do that is since all of these simulations, right, are run on that same sort of turn over turn grid at the same prescribed ranges, we multiply our optimized damage at a given range by the survivability at a given range. So why do we do that? Well, if I've got a hunchback, and I've got an AC-20, man, that thing's massive, but the mech's slow. It's got good armor, but, it's still a 50-ton mech. If that mech is only getting into range half of the time, that weapon is really not as effective as if you have it on a king crab, where it's going to get, it's 100 tons, got a ton of armor, it's going to get into range, right? So these are the kinds of things we need to think about when we're talking about effectiveness, right? So how likely am I going to, how likely of a chance do I have to bring my firepower to bear? And so again, we multiply survivability by our optimized ACD. And the chart at the top represents that, the dark line being the optimized ACD, the white trend line being your survival rate, and then the lighter blue area being your effective ACD, and again, ACD being your average calculated damage. So what we notice is as that survivability curve drops off, right, you can see that the effective ACD begins to pull away from the optimized, and again, that's because we're multiplying those two things together. So some key metrics here on the bottom of your screen. So defensively, remember this survived 77.4% of the time. That's key. And then we had 130.4 on our baseline damage. We were able to juice that up to 142.9, And then when we look at the effective number over 12 turns, we're at 130.8. So we're basically right at baseline, when we factor in the effectiveness of this mech. And, overall, it's only a drop in 12 points of damage, give or take. That's less than 10%, so that's very good. Now, side note, you might be wondering, well, Aaron, WTF, 77.4%, 142, these numbers don't match up. Well, remember, we're not multiplying the cumulative survivability by the total damage over 12 turns. We're multiplying it at each turn. So at turn 1, where this mech is dropping in LRM fire, it hasn't died yet. It's claiming 100% of that damage at turn 1 and turn 2 and turn 3. And then when the survivability drops, like I think it's around turn 4, that's when you start seeing those graphs pull apart. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so that effective ACD, that 130.8 in the light blue bar, that's a key metric for us because that's how we're going to calculate our efficiency score. So we want to figure out how much damage are we getting over 12 turns for our battle value, right? And so what I do is, we take a look at that 130.8 and we'd say, how much damage per 100 BV am I getting? So this mech is 1436 BV. So basically you take that 130.8 and you divide it by the battle value divided by 100. And we do it per 100 BV because otherwise you'd get a decimal and it wouldn't be as meaningful. And for some of the worse mechs like, the Charger with 5 small lasers, that decimal would be very small. So we do it per 100 BV to give us a nice round number. And so in the Zeus's case, we end up with a 6.51. Now it just so happens that a 5 is about average on the bell curve of mechs. A 10 is not a perfect score. There's mechs that exceed that. There are some factory freaks like the Longbow and the Annihilator 1E that just do gobs of ungodly amounts of damage and have ridiculously low battle values. I didn't design it, but that's just how it shakes out. And so those mechs are like tip and 11s and sometimes 12s in the efficiency. But when we look at it on the bell curve and we kind of remove those outliers, it turns out that a 5 is basically just about average. So a 6.51 is doing pretty good. That Zeus is pretty efficient. Very good bang for buck for what you get there. All right, so on the right side of your screen, this is new in Battlytics 2.0. This is a gunnery score sensitivity. So what I wanted to show here was what is our ability to sort of reap more reward by buying up our gunnery skill from a 4 to a 3 to a 2 to a 1 to a 0. So the purple line represents just that. Our efficiency score from a gunnery 4 all the way to a gunnery 0. So you can see, a G4, basically your efficiency score would be 4.75. And that's less than average, but that's less than average for all gunnery 2 mechs, right? I mean, because all of these simulations are done at a gunnery 2, including the defensive sim that Awesome is shooting with a gunnery 2. So that's just the number I use. And so basically you can kind of see though that the slope of the line increases pretty rapidly from gunnery 4 to gunnery 3 and then starts to level off from, when you go to 2 to 1 to 0. So, you're still getting a return on your investment. You're still going to get a more efficient mech at gunnery 0, but the slope of the line sort of shows you, how much more are you getting, right? So for example, when you go from gunnery 3 to gunnery 2, your jump in efficiency is like, 0.8, 0.9. When you go from gunnery 1 to gunnery 0, it's like a 0.22 increase. So there's less of a gain the higher you go. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit of a mind bender. I had to stare at it for a while to make sense of it. And so what I decided to do was fit a trend line to this, because every mech generally has that same curve, but the slope of that curve is different. Mechs that have a bias towards longer range weapons tend to, not always, but tend to have more of a benefit for better gunnery, whereas like a short-range brawler may not see as much of a benefit. And so the sensitivity score is basically the slope of the trend line that fits all of those points, and it's a linear, I chose a linear fit because we needed to get a slope. And so this mech is about 0.632. Now, the highest slope that I've seen in the mechs that we've tested is in, I think, 0.74, maybe 0.77. Anyway, it's in the 0.7 range. So this mech is pretty sensitive. It responds very well to increases in gunnery. And when we get into the Wolverine, you'll see like, you know, that mech a little bit different, so I won't spoil it. At the very bottom here, the area chart. So what are we looking at here? Well, basically this is your effective damage output at each gunnery score. So the darkest area being gunnery 0, the lightest area being gunnery, the darkest area, yeah, being gunnery 0, the lightest area being gunnery 4, sorry. And essentially, you can see there in the legend also has it, but the legend also has in parentheses the total damage output. So similar to what you would see on the bar chart, if you notice gunnery 2, 130.8, and then in the bar chart 130.8. Hopefully that makes sense. But what you're really looking at here is you want to look at the areas where there's the biggest delta or the biggest separation between two areas. So for example, you'll notice gunnery 0, you're getting a massive benefit on the back end, right? So turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, that is where you're starting to see like a lot of return on that investment. But then as you get past turn 4, the delta shrinks, right? And as you get closer and closer in range, gunnery 3, gunnery 2 are looking pretty good. So it's not just about like, hey, this mech is efficient, in general, right? There are certain areas where higher gunnery suits mechs better or not, right? And I think it's important to show this because if you have a particular strategy you want to play, like I'm on a blitzkrieg and I'm going to rush and I want to get in close, or I'm on an urban map, or or you're like, hey, I'm in like the Dust Bowl here and there's no cover anywhere to be found. Figuring out how you're going to tune your mechs and what gunnery you want to stick in there. This is kind of cool to do that. All right, so here we are, last screen, role analysis. So what we're looking at here is basically an amalgamation of just about all of our data, some new looks at the mech's sort of damage capabilities, heat to damage ratios, basically its overall threat. We put all that together and we make some assumptions or some subjective opinions about where I think it would be good on the battlefield. So let's take a look here, top left, some key metrics from our analysis so far. Our optimized ACD, again, that's average calculated damage, we're at 142.9. This mech generated 6.9 damage with every hit in our lethality index. It has a survival rate of 77.4%, very high. Movement at 4.6. Redline heat was 208, and its efficiency score at 6.51, and its sensitivity to gunnery at 0.632. So we bundle all that into a report card and we get 5 main scores we're looking at: offensive, defensive, mobility, control, efficiency. Offensively, this mech scores a 4 out of 5. It's really good. It's about where you would want an assault mech to be, anywhere in that 4 to 5 range. Obviously, it's sort of a lighter assault mech, so I think a 4 is right on point for this mech. Defensively, also a 4. Very solid performance by this mech. Again, I think there's some opportunities for improvement on that right side torso. Incidentally, I also think there's opportunity for improvement offensively by flipping that medium laser around. We'll talk about that when we get to the threat envelope. Mobility-wise, 2.0, not much to say there. I mean, it's not very fast, but it's quick for an assault mech. But, it's still a 4.6, right? Control-wise, this mech can generate a lot of heat. That large laser PPC tandem can overload the heat sinks very quickly. So you just need to be careful about when you're using that large laser. The PPC is way more efficient as a weapon. So, what you should be doing is using that as your primary. And then if that PPC gets destroyed, or you have the opportunity to fire, as we did in sort of our optimized benchmarking, fire every other turn with the large, you can definitely do that. But you definitely need to have some control, some self-control on the trigger to manage this mech effectively. And then efficiency overall, it scored above average. So we're at a 3.5 for this mech. Again, at the 6.51 score there, that's a little bit above average. So, on the report card there, that's above average. It's pretty good. So on the bottom half of the screen, let's look at these sort of threat analyses before we jump into the roles. So the threat assessment on the bottom left. So this is a pretty cool analysis, and what we're looking at here, the dark red area, the dark red bars represent your Alpha Strike capability. So this is total damage. This is not a simulation. This is just straight math. How much damage can I do at a given range if I fire everything, irrespective of heat? So, right, you're 21 inches, you can do 15 damage. The only weapon you got, LRM 15. When that PPC comes into play at 18 inches, you see that steps up 25 damage, and so on and so forth. Large laser, medium laser, all these things come into play. So there we are, right? And that damage meter is on the left side, on that y-axis there on the left side. The light red area is our maximum average calculated damage. So again, we're just looking at, forget heat, forget all these things. You know, there's some assumptions, you know, I believe, you know, so gunnery's 2, you walked, the target has a +2 mod, right? So you're at a +5 base, and then it adds in range for the weapon based on what range you're at. So if you're at 21 inches, you're firing your LRM, you're at long range, you add 4 to that, right? And so it does this average calculated damage for these weapons, right? And you can see the red line, there's sort of the red bars, right? It begins to step up at a different pace than your maximum, right? What this thing also takes into account is minimum range. So you can see it peaks at about 6 inches, and then it starts to drop off. This does not take into account ammunition. So unlike our simulations, this is just like, what can I do, you know, maximally if I Alpha Strike and hit with everything, and what am I likely to do? All right, if I shoot everything and hit with everything, what's the average damage that I'm going to do? Or not hit with everything, but just shoot everything, what's the average that I'm likely to get? Okay, so you've got our maximum ACD, you've got our maximum Alpha Strike. What's this yellow line, this threat ratio? Well, this is basically, if I look at a ratio of the amount of damage I could possibly do versus the amount of damage I'm likely to do, right? And then we divide all that by how much heat I'm going to generate. So again, I talk about heat as a currency, right? So we're looking at a total ratio of like what I can do, what I'm likely to do, and what's it going to cost me. That's what this yellow line is. And what this yellow line shows us is how effective, or where this mech is most effective, right? How much threat am I really generating? How much, you know, what's my damage over heat? All of these types of things. So what you can see here is that, you know, the Zeus, I mean, you know, it doesn't look real flat to you, but it's a pretty, as far as curves go for this is a pretty flat curve. This mech is very effective, you know, especially once that PPC comes into play. You know, you can see a little bit of a dip once the large laser comes into play because of the heat load, but then it starts to climb again. Once you get into 9 inches, right, it dips again because that medium laser comes into play. And then it, you know, peaks at about 6 inches. We talked about that 6 inches being the sort of the optimal Alpha Strike range. But really, you know, it's that backfield, that, you know, 21 to 10 inch range where this mech, in my opinion, really shines, because you don't have to worry as much about the heat load. You know, you can back off the large laser if you need to. And really, you know, that threat index is pretty high and pretty consistent across the board. So, right side, we're looking at the threat envelope. So a threat envelope is our sort of visual to represent where this mech can shoot, how far it can shoot, and its overlapping fields of fire from its weapons. So what you can see here is on the right side, it's got that LRM, right? So it can swing that right arm around all the way out to that rear right arc, and it can generate a pretty solid arc of fire there, very far out to 21 inches. You know, each one of these little lines, I believe, is 3 inches. Yeah. And it goes from 3, you know, basically from 0 all the way to 24 inches, which is the maximum range in this era, right? AC2 shoots 24. So basically every one of those little lines is a 3-inch mark there. So you can see that LRM goes all the way out. On the opposite side, the rear left arc only goes out to 18 inches. And that's because, again, that PPC is on that arm. You know, I'd say only 18 inches. 18 inches is very far. So it has a really nice, almost 360-degree arc of fire. Of course, if you factor in torso twisting, you have real nice coverage. And then you've got that lone medium laser that really isn't doing much in that back arc. Anytime I play the Zeus, I play a variant where that medium laser is flipped forward, and I redistribute that armor on the torso, which we talked about earlier. But this mech has the heat sinks and is fully capable of having two forward-facing medium lasers. And you can back off that large laser. You can just fire the two mediums once you get within 9. They're way more efficient. So anyway, that's sort of a side note on modifications. And maybe we'll dive into, you know, some optional Zeus variants down the road. But for now, we're just sticking to the stock mech as it is. So taking all of that into consideration, everything we've talked about here, you know, when I think about this mech and what roles it would play, there are really 3 main roles, and they have not changed since the first iteration when we piloted the Battlytics engine with the Zeus. I still think this mech is a very strong defender. It has that incredible survivability. It has that strong mid-range punch. It has decent speed to reposition. It's not super fast, but it's fast enough to get itself around the battlefield. So, you know, that's one of the roles I would absolutely put this mech in. Secondly is a frontline mech. So this is a mech that I would absolutely have no problems putting out in the forefront of a vanguard to try to draw fire off other targets. Now, when I would use this mech in a frontline role, I would be very conscious of that LRM ammo, because that's one of the leading factors, one of the main causes of death for this mech. So if you start getting damage on that right side, you get punctured, just dump that ammo. Don't even worry about it. But if you're firing aggressively, you spend a couple of turns at range, most of your ammo will be depleted anyway. So hopefully, you know, you can dump it before it becomes a problem, or just expend it before it's even an issue. But you know, when you're in that frontline role, you definitely need to keep an eye, you know, on that right torso. And the last role I would say is a skirmisher role. And so, you know, in a skirmisher role, this mech would succeed if it's one of the faster mechs on the field. So in our frontline role, I would play it in a frontline role when it's one of the bigger mechs on the field. In a skirmisher role, I'd play it when it's one of the smaller mechs on the field. And so, you know, when the Zeus is one of the smaller mechs and you're playing in a lance of like Annihilators, Atlas, King Crab, you know, Awesomes, like things that are 3.5s and 2.3s, this mech looks really fast. And it can get out on a flank. It has the range and it has the heat sinks to, you know, basically sustain fire on a target, and it's got some scary weapons. We saw in the lethality index, it is capable of those head kills, you know, so it can't be ignored. So it's great out on a flank to just draw mechs out of the fight or force attention its way while your bigger, slower mechs can get into point blank and unleash, for example, a pair of claw-mounted AC-20s or whatever, you know, you've got up your sleeve. But yeah, this mech can definitely do good in that skirmisher role. You know, one final thing, I guess, is, you know, as I look at this, you know, and I look at the sensitivity to gunnery, this mech wouldn't make a bad command mech either. You know, you put your best pilot in this mech with a good low gunnery score, it will return dividends, especially, you know, gunnery 2 or gunnery 1 if you play that low. I mean, this mech can really, really rack up some hits and do very well, because what can happen is the better you are at piloting, like if you're running a 1 pilot, you can start stacking gunnery penalties for heat. You can alpha strike deeper and longer. Just don't get up to that ammo critical chance on the heat meter, but you know, you can stack a +1 penalty to gunnery and do just fine. And again, as we looked at the mobility analysis, it can take on that MP penalty from heat as well. So might not be a bad command choice either. And so that's that, guys. That wraps up our take 2 here on the Zeus. Hope you liked it. Hope you liked the new analysis. Would be interested in your feedback. We'll be pulling down the other video, or at least you know, archiving that one. Appreciate everybody's comments on that. They were instrumental and crucial to the evolution of this this analysis engine. So thank you for that, guys. Thanks for subscribing. Give us a like. Let us know what you think. If you haven't subscribed, definitely do that. And stay tuned. We got a lot more coming. More campaign battle reports, more hobby tutorials. We got some product reviews lined up. We had some vendors send us some really cool stuff. So we're going to paint it up and show it to you. So stay tuned. From Death from Above Wargaming, all that's coming right your way soon.